And here are the answers. And if you did it right, you can continue to the next video. If you had it wrong, you can also continue to the next video, but it may be instructive to rewatch the previous video. Then another tool that the government has to impact the market, besides price regulations and quota, are taxes and subsidies. And we will start with taxes. So how do taxes impact markets? Some taxes are imposed to correct for other market failures, and we will come to that when we discuss the externalities. But in general, taxes will distort markets. Now, suppose that Groningen would consider introducing a 50-cent tax on every movie ticket sold. How would that affect the market for movie tickets? So, doing this with a figure. So, before the introduction of the tax, the point X denotes the equilibrium outcome. So we have an equilibrium price of 8 and an equilibrium quantity of 4. And now the municipality introduces a tax. So what does it mean? It means that the sellers have to pay 50 cents per ticket sold to the government. So the price that the sellers receive is the price that the buyers pay for the movie ticket minus the tax that the sellers have to pay to the municipality. So there's a wedge between the price that the sellers receive and the price that the buyers pay, and that wedge is equal to the amount of the tax. Now, how to read this picture, and this may be rather subtle as you see it for the first time. But now suppose that if you look at the supply curve, what you can see is that we introduce this tax here in the form of a shift in the supply curve from the old curve S1 to a new red curve S2. Now, how to read it? Suppose that at a price of €7.80, previously 3.4 sellers were willing to supply, not 3.4 sellers, but the total supply of movie tickets would be 340,000 movie tickets. So that means that after the introduction of the tax, apparently the suppliers, they want to receive net €7.80, but now they know that in order to have a net revenue of a ticket of €7.80, they need to get €8.30 from the buyer. So where initially at a price of €7.80, the supply of movie tickets was 340,000. Now it stopped up, and only at a price of €8.30, you will have a supply of 330,000 movie tickets. So the entire supply curve shifts up with 50 cents. So also here, so the old equilibrium price of 8, the movie theaters would in aggregate be willing to sell 400,000 tickets, but now they have to pay the tax, so they are not willing to sell 400,000 tickets for €8 to the buyer, but they want to have €8.50 from the buyer. So the wedge between the old and the new supply curve is exactly identical to the size of the tax, 50 cents. So the supply curve denotes what price the buyers want to receive from, or what price the sellers want to receive from the buyers. And that has to, in equilibrium, be identical to the demand by the buyers. So we look for the new equilibrium, and we will find a new equilibrium at the point where they intersect these two curves, which is point Y. And so the new equilibrium price is equal to €8.30. That will be the price that the buyers need to pay, and the price that the sellers will receive after having paid the tax of 50 cents is €7.80. Now, what happened to the surplus? In the old situation, the consumer surplus was equal to the area A plus B plus C. But now in the new situation, some people no longer go to the movie theater. So we have a deadweight loss equal to the pink triangle over here. So that is really lost. That's the deadweight loss. But there's also a transfer, and now not from consumers to producers, but from consumers to the government, because 340,000 movie tickets are still sold to the public, but the public has to pay €8.30, which leaves them with a surplus equal to the area A. The producers, they only receive €7.80, which gives them a producer surplus of in total equal to the area F. And then there's this gap of 50 cents. For every ticket sold, the government will earn 50 cents. So the total revenue to the government is equal to the area B plus D, which is 340,000 times 50 cents. Now, one of the deeper insights here is the tax incidence. So the government introduces a tax of 50 cents, but who ends up paying this tax? Well, you can see in the previous example that the price that the buyers need to pay increased from €8 to €8.30. So of the tax of 50 cents, they end up paying 30 cents of the tax, and the producers, they end up paying 20 cents because they no longer receive €8 net, but they receive only €7.80. So 2/5 of the tax is paid by the producers in this case, and 3/5 by the consumers. And noted that I started the story telling you that the government or the municipality will get the tax from the movie theaters. But that doesn't really matter. So for the equilibrium price, it's independent whether the tax is collected from the movie theaters or whether it's collected from the consumers. And that's one of the things that you really need to be aware of, that it doesn't matter who is required to pay the tax. So whether it's a sale tax or a production tax, the tax incidence, who will pay the tax burden, will be identical in both situations. Now again, for the movie theater, that would look as follows. So we had a situation where the seller had to pay the 50 cents per ticket tax, such that the seller would end up with the price paid by the buyer minus the tax that he has to pay to the government. And we had a shift in the supply curve as depicted in the left panel over here. But now suppose that instead it would not be the sellers who need to pay the tax, but the buyers. Now then the buyers would take into account that when they go to the movie theater, they not only have to pay PS to the seller, but they also need to pay in addition a tax to the government, say in the form of a value added tax. So the buyers take into account that in total they have to pay PS plus tax, which leads to a downward shift in the demand curve, because previously they were willing to buy Q1 tickets at a price of P1, but now they're willing to pay 50 cents less because they know that on top of the price paid to the seller, they also need to pay the tax. But then, if you equate these two lines, so the old supply function and now the new demand function, then this will be the equilibrium price, but this will be the price that the seller will receive, and in the end the buyer will end up paying 50 cents more, because in addition to the price paid to the seller, the buyer also needs to pay the tax to the government. But we have the same equilibrium outcome in the left panel as in the right panel. So it doesn't matter whether you impose the tax on the seller or on the buyer, the equilibrium outcome will be the same in both cases. And that's important because you often have policy measures that say, well, we need to impose a tax on producers who pollute. And then you may think, oh, this is good, I don't have to pay because the polluters, the producers, they will pay. But tax incidence says that it really doesn't matter because producers will just increase the price of their product, and in the end you will pay your share of the tax. But how much consumers pay relative to producers, that again really much depends on the shape of the supply and the demand curve. And that's what we're going to discuss in the end. So there's a relation between tax incidence, who needs to pay what part of the tax in equilibrium, and the elasticity. And in general, it holds that if demand is very elastic, then producers will pay more of the cost of a tax and vice versa. And there are two general formulas. This is the price elasticity of supply, this is the price elasticity of demand, and the share of a tax that is borne by consumers is equal to the price elasticity of supply divided by the sum of the two elasticities, where the vertical bars again denote that the price elasticity is negative, but the absolute value is positive. Now, what's the intuition? Suppose that the supply is very inelastic. So ES is very small and relative to the price elasticity of demand. Then it means that the producers, they will pay a high fraction of the tax, and the consumers, they will only pay a small fraction. So a high price elasticity of demand will tells you that if you increase the price a bit, then many consumers will quit buying the product. And because they are so responsive to price changes, they will also be very responsive to the introduction of a tax. And because they respond, for example, by buying other goods instead, they will end up not paying a lot of the tax. If the demand is inelastic, so for example, for fuel, consumers don't have a lot of substitutes. So if the price of fuel increases, they don't have many options than to continue buying fuel. So they're kind of locked in. They don't have a lot of bargaining power, and they end up paying a high share of the tax. So two examples to show this in pictures, this difference. So here on the left panel, we have a situation with a very elastic demand curve, and on the right-hand side, we have a very inelastic demand curve. And one thing that you need to note from this example is that in the left panel, we have the labor market, where individuals are the suppliers of labor. It's you and me, the workers, and the people who demand the labor are the firms. So that's the opposite from what we normally consider, but in the labor market, it's the firms who demand labor, and the price of labor is denoted by W because we think of it as the wage rate. Now suppose that you tax labor. What will happen to the wage rate that laborers receive and the wage that the firms pay to the workers? Well, if demand is very elastic, it means that there's only a small increase in wage rate needed for the firms to really decrease their quantity of labor that they demand. For example, because they substitute labor for capital. So they have quite a bit of bargaining power here, which also means that if you increase the price of labor by imposing a tax on labor, then in the new equilibrium, the wage that the workers receive will be only, or that the firms pay will be only slightly more than before. So WB is the price that the buyers of labor, in this case the firms, need to pay. And you can see that the difference between WB and W1, the old equilibrium wage, is pretty small. So they end up paying only a very small share of this tax, and most of the tax is paid by the people who supply the labor, the workers, because the wage that they receive decrease from W1 to WS. Now, on the right-hand side, we have the market for cigarettes. Cigarettes are addictive, which means that people who buy cigarettes are often not that responsive to price increases of cigarettes. They have an inelastic demand, and that leads them to pay a fair share of any tax that's imposed on cigarettes because they don't have a lot of substitutes. And you can see that here the old equilibrium price of cigarettes is P1. Now a tax is imposed on cigarettes, and you can see that the new price that the buyers pay, PB, is quite a bit larger than P1. So of this new tax, which in total is equal to the area PB minus PS, the consumers of cigarettes, they end up to paying a big chunk, PB minus P1, and the producers of cigarettes, they only end up paying a very small share, P1 minus PS. So the tax incidence here is high incidence on consumers, low incidence on producers, because the demand for cigarettes is very inelastic. This brings us to the final quiz of this lecture. And the question is, suppose that demand is given by 100 minus P, supply is given by P. You may remember this one from the previous quiz. Question is new. What is the deadweight loss of a tax of 10 per unit raised on consumers? And what is the incidence of that tax? So which chunk has to be paid by consumers and which fraction by producers? And here is the answer. So instead of introducing taxes, a government may also want to introduce subsidies, and especially if they want to stimulate the consumption of certain products, they may introduce subsidies, like for example on solar panels. And subsidies are just a negative tax, and they can be treated that way. As taxes, they drive a wedge between the price that consumers pay and the price that producers receive, but since it's a negative tax, the amount that producers receive, PS, is more than the price that the buyers pay because of the subsidy. Government, they subsidize a lot of things. They give subsidies to producers in the form of R&D subsidies, but they also give subsidies to consumers. For example, the college fee is much lower than the cost of higher education, so that is subsidized. Public transport is subsidized, and you can think of many other examples. Final picture very much works as what we've seen before. Suppose that the producers receive a subsidy. In the old situation, their supply function was equal to the blue line S1, but now they know that, well, on top of the amount that they get from the consumers, they will also receive a subsidy from the government, which makes them willing to pay to supply more units at the same price to consumers. So the supply curve shifts to the right, equal to the area S line S2. And again, we have a shift and a transfer of consumer surplus, but we also have a deadweight loss. And in this case, the deadweight loss is equal to the area E plus I, because in the new situation, there are some consumers who are now able to buy the product, although their willingness to pay is less than what the producers originally wanted to have in order to supply the product to these consumers. So the total cost to the government is equal to, well, the number of units that they need to subsidize, which is equal to the number Q2. And on each unit sold, they have to pay a subsidy equal to PS minus PB. So the total subsidy that the government needs to pay is equal to B plus D plus E plus I plus H plus F. But some of them is just a transfer from the government to producers and consumers, so it's not lost. The only part that's really lost is the deadweight loss that is given over here. And this really brings us to the end of this chapter, where we looked at supply and demand in more detail and really zoomed into the role of policymakers and how they can affect market outcomes by price regulations, quantity regulations, taxes, and subsidies. In the next chapter, we will take one step back and we will focus on consumers and how their preferences translate into demand for products and consumption decisions.